You're lying in bed right now. Maybe you scrolled past a few things before landing here. Maybe there's a glass of water on your nightstand. Maybe the room smells faintly like laundry detergent or whatever candle you last burned. You feel the pillow against the back of your head. Your body is warm. You know roughly what tomorrow looks like. And if something went wrong tonight, really wrong, you'd call an ambulance, and within minutes, strangers with morphine and defibrillators and decades of medical training would show up at your door to keep you alive. Now rewind 40,000 years. There is no ambulance. There is no morphine. There is no door. You are lying on a packed earth floor inside a rock overhang, and the people around you, the only people who will ever know your name, are watching you die, and nobody in your entire world has any idea how to stop it. So the question is almost unbearable. For 200,000 years of being human, with no hospitals, no painkillers, no understanding of what was even happening inside the body, what did your ancestors actually do on the last day of their lives? Let's start with what was probably killing them, because it wasn't what you'd guess. You might picture a saber-toothed cat or a dramatic fall off a cliff. And sure, those things happened, but the biggest killer in the Paleolithic was invisible. According to paleopathologist Caleb Finch at the University of Southern California, contagious infections and septic wounds were likely the dominant cause of death for most of human existence. An estimate published in the journal PNAS suggests that roughly 75% of deaths in the Paleolithic era were caused by infection, not predators. Not warfare, bacteria, a scratch from a thorn that got infected, a broken tooth that let something into the bloodstream, a cut on the foot during a hunt that, within 48 hours, turned into a raging fever that the body simply couldn't fight. That means your ancestors' last day probably didn't begin with a dramatic event. It probably began with a morning that felt almost normal, except they were weaker than yesterday, and hotter, and their breathing sounded different, and everybody around them knew what those signs meant, because they'd watched this exact thing happen before. Death in the ancient world wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow arrival that everyone could see coming. Here's the part nobody talks about. You'd think that in a brutal survival environment, ice ages, scarce food, predators on every horizon, the logical move would be to abandon the sick, cut your losses, keep the group moving. Some animals do exactly that, but humans didn't. And we know this not because of guesswork or sentiment, but because of bones. In northern Iraq, inside a place called Shanidar Cave, archaeologist Ralph Selecki and his team uncovered the remains of a Neanderthal man in the 1950s. They called him Shanidar I. His skeleton told a horror story, a crushing blow to the left side of his skull that likely blinded him in one eye, a withered right arm that had been amputated below the elbow, damage to his right foot and ankle that would have given him a severe limp, and bone deformities suggesting he was partially deaf. According to the Smithsonian's Human Origins program, all of his injuries show signs of healing. None of them killed him. He survived into his 40s, which, in the Paleolithic world, made him an old man. There is simply no way a blind, one-armed, limping, partially deaf individual survived decades in an Ice Age wilderness alone. Somebody fed him. Somebody walked slower so he could keep up. Somebody, on the day he finally couldn't get up anymore, sat next to him in the dark of that cave and stayed. Think about that for a second. The oldest evidence we have of disability care isn't some enlightened modern policy. It's a Neanderthal in a cave more than 45,000 years ago. And that pattern doesn't stop with Neanderthals. Go even further back, to 1.77 million years ago, at a place called Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia, and there's a skull, catalogued as D3444, of a Homo erectus individual who had lost all but one tooth years before death. In 2005, paleoanthropologist David Lord-Kipanidze published a study describing a beautifully preserved skull and jawbone from this individual who was essentially toothless for a long stretch of life. Without teeth, this person couldn't chew raw meat or tough plant material. Somebody pre-chewed food for them, or found softer things for them to eat, or ground nourishment down to a paste against a stone. Almost 2 million years before we had language, we had compassion. That is the oldest evidence of caregiving in the entire human fossil record. So on the last day of someone's life in the deep past, they almost certainly were not alone. But what were the people around them actually doing? Here's where it gets fascinating, because your ancestors weren't just sitting there helplessly. They were practicing medicine, or at least their version of it. At the El Sidrón cave site in northern Spain, researcher Karen Hardy and her team examined 50,000-year-old dental calculus, the hardened plaque, from Neanderthal teeth. Inside that calculus, they found chemical compounds from yarrow and chamomile, two plants with almost no nutritional value, but well-documented anti-inflammatory and antiseptic properties. These are bitter, unpleasant plants. You wouldn't eat them because they taste good. You'd eat them because someone in your group taught you that they help when you're hurting. Hardy called it evidence of Neanderthal self-medication. Published in 2012, the study suggested that these ancient people were actively seeking out medicinal plants and deliberately consuming them. So picture the last day differently now. The person lying on the cave floor isn't just being watched. Somebody is crushing bitter herbs between two stones and pressing the paste against their lips. Somebody is bringing water, cupped in hands or carried in a hollowed piece of bark. Somebody is trying every single thing they've ever been taught about making the pain stop, even though none of it is going to be enough this time. The knowledge is crude, but the impulse, that desperate scramble to do something, anything, is identical to what you'd feel if someone you loved was dying in front of you right now. Here's what doesn't make sense until you think about it. If death was so common, so visible, so woven into daily life, your ancestors saw children die, saw hunting partners die, saw parents die, all without the clinical sterility of hospitals and closed doors, then they must have developed rituals around it far earlier than we assumed. And the archaeological record backs this up in the most stunning way. At Qafzeh Cave in Israel, about 100,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens buried at least 15 of their dead inside a cave, carefully positioned, some with grave goods like red ochre and seashells. This is the oldest known intentional burial site for modern humans. 100,000 years ago, someone decided that the body of the person they lost mattered, that it couldn't just be left for scavengers, that it needed to be placed deliberately, in a specific spot, with objects that meant something. And then look at what happens as the millennia roll on. At Sunghir, about 200 kilometers east of modern Moscow, around 34,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers buried an adult man covered in approximately 3,000 mammoth ivory beads, each one of which would have taken about an hour to carve. Do the math on that. 3,000 hours of someone's life in an era where every hour was survival poured into decorating a dead man's clothing. Alongside him, 2 children were buried head to head, surrounded by ivory spears, carved antlers, and fox-tooth ornaments. Archaeologist Eric Trinkhaus at Washington University noted that these children showed signs of physical abnormalities, visible disabilities that likely set them apart during their lives. They weren't discarded. They were given the most lavish burial in the entire European Paleolithic record. This tells you something shattering about the last day of life in the ancient world. The dying person wasn't just being treated as a body failing. They were being treated as a story ending, a story the community felt needed a final chapter worthy of the life that preceded it. The beads were being carved before the person died. The grave was being prepared while they still breathed. The last day of life in the ancient world was not just about dying. It was about the living, deciding what that death would mean. And at Shanidar Cave, where we started, there's one more detail. Around one of the Neanderthal burials, the one archaeologists call Shanidar 4, clusters of ancient pollen were discovered by paleobotanist Arlette Leroy-Gourhan in the 1960s. Selecki famously interpreted this as evidence of a flower burial, that someone had gathered wildflowers, cornflowers, hollyhocks, yarrow, and laid them around the body. Now, debate has swirled for decades about whether those pollen clumps were placed by hands or carried in by burrowing rodents. But recent work by Emma Pomeroy and her team at Cambridge, who uncovered a new Neanderthal skeleton near the exact same spot, has reopened the case. They found that Neanderthals returned to the same location within the cave, placing bodies near a large rock, over and over. Whether or not the flowers were intentional, the return was. The place itself mattered. Imagine being the one dying. You're lying in the same spot where you once watched your mother laid to rest. The rock above you is the same rock. The voices around you are different now, younger, but the words might be the same. Whatever sounds your people made for grief, for comfort, for goodbye, you heard them first as a child standing over someone else, and now they're for you. There is something so deeply human about that, the loop of it, the continuity, that it makes your chest tight just thinking about it. But let's push into the hardest part of this. What about the pain? Because we've talked about care and medicine and ritual, but the raw physical reality of dying in the Paleolithic was a thing no modern human would recognize. There was no concept of dosing or anesthesia. When infection took hold and fever spiked, the body would have shaken with chills in a place where the best technology for warming was a fire and another person's body heat. The final hours of death from sepsis, which is what an untreated infection becomes, can involve organ failure, delirium, a kind of drowning from the inside as the lungs fill with fluid. Modern medicine can manage this. Ancient humans just had to witness it, and yet they stayed. That's the thing that keeps coming up in the archaeological record, the thing that archaeologist Lorna Tilley calls the bioarchaeology of care. At Manbac, a Neolithic site about 100 kilometers south of Hanoi in Vietnam, Tilley helped uncover the skeleton of a man who had Klippel-Feil syndrome, a rare genetic disease that fused his vertebrae and left him paralyzed from the waist down with limited arm mobility. He lived with this condition for roughly 10 years, dying in his mid-20s around 4,000 years ago. For a decade, in a community already showing signs of famine and malnutrition in the bones of its other members, people fed him, cleaned him, moved him to prevent bed sores, and kept him alive. Think about that. They were starving, and they still fed the man who couldn't feed himself. Tilley says the most important thing we can learn from the past is the consistency of care. From the very earliest times, we can see evidence that people who were unable to function were helped, looked after, and given what care was available. So here's where we zoom out. Death came at your ancestors from every direction. Infection, injury, cold, starvation, the sheer biological fragility of a body with no safety net. And on their last day, the people around them answered each of those threats in the only ways they could. They answered infection with bitter herbs crushed against the teeth. They answered cold with fire and the warmth of their own bodies pressed close. They answered pain with presence, the sound of familiar voices saying whatever words their language had for, "I am here." And they answered the finality of it, the incomprehensible vanishing of a person they loved, by refusing to let the body be nothing. They placed it carefully. They adorned it with beads that took 1,000 hours to carve. They carried flowers into the dark of a cave. They came back to the same spot generation after generation because the place where their people rested was sacred before the word sacred existed. And that's the part that changes how you see everything. We think of ancient humans as primitive. We think of their lives as short and brutal and void of meaning. But the evidence says the opposite. The evidence says that the very first recognizably human thing our species ever did, before art, before agriculture, before language as we know it, was to refuse to let each other die alone. A toothless old man in Georgia, 1.77 million years ago, was fed soft food by hands that didn't have to help him. A blind, one-armed Neanderthal in Iraq lived for decades because his people wouldn't leave him behind. 2 disabled children in Russia were buried with more care and beauty than most kings in recorded history. That's not primitive. That's the most sophisticated thing a living creature has ever done. You're still in your bed. The pillow is still soft against your head. The glass of water is still on your nightstand. Somewhere in the walls of your house, the electricity hums, keeping you warm, keeping the light on, holding the darkness at whatever distance you choose. You have every comfort your ancestors fought 100,000 generations to give you. But the one thing you have that matters most, The knowledge that if your last day came tomorrow, someone would be there, that isn't new. That's the oldest technology our species ever invented.